Hi, everybody. This is Adam Elenbaas from Nightlight Astrology. It's Wednesday, September 5th, and we're going to talk about a lineup of astrological configurations that are taking place this week and over the weekend, maybe into next week a little bit. But it's a good day to do so because there's a number of things that are all happening pretty much simultaneously. I'll go down the list of the transits that are coming into the picture right now and just give you a sense of which planetary transits we're going to be talking about today one by one, and then we'll go through them one at a time. So the first one, fastest transit, is today's moon in Cancer will be opposite to Pluto in Capricorn. So we're going to talk a little bit about moon opposite Pluto. Also, the next thing on the list is that Saturn in Capricorn at around 2 degrees is stationing and turning direct after a long period of being retrograde. When we go beyond that, we're looking at an upcoming opposition from the Sun to Neptune and a new moon that's coming up with that opposition to the Sun. Mercury is about to enter Virgo, so we're going to talk a little bit about that. And then last but not least, Venus is going to be squaring Mars in the next couple of days here. So that's the list. Moon opposite Pluto, Saturn stationing to turn direct, Sun opposite Neptune, Mercury about to enter Virgo, and Venus square Mars. So a good lineup of things to talk about. Now, one of the intentions that I have for today is to not only discuss what you can expect in a mundane sense, in other words, what kinds of symbolic or archetypal correspondences might you see in your life related to these transits right now, which we'll do, but also I want to try to address some of the deeper teachings that are available to us right now within each of these transits. And of course, there's probably an unlimited amount of teachings available to us, but we'll mention some of the big ones that often come about with the different kinds of planetary combinations and what mental and emotional traps we tend to fall in with them, and how we may respond spiritually so that we take every transit as an opportunity to grow spiritually. So, all right, so that's what we'll do. All right, let's start off with the moon opposite Pluto. So the moon opposite Pluto is going to happen once every moon cycle because the moon goes through the entire zodiac in one lunar month. You say goes around the synodic cycle from new moon to new moon, going through the whole zodiac. Usually there's actually an additional 13th sign that the moon will go into after having gone through the whole 12 in order to catch the sun again. So the average that you'll sort of see per calendar month, you'll usually see the moon opposite Pluto like once. So it's not something that's like a huge deal in astrology world. You got 12 or maybe 13 of them in a year. But every time that it comes around, ever since Pluto's entered Capricorn, which is, going on 10 years almost. So you got a long time of dealing with this. Every time the moon's going to be in Cancer when it opposes Pluto. So there are some, very basic symbolic meanings that come along with the sun, or the moon opposite Pluto across the Cancer and Capricorn axis. So one of the things that comes up is the dichotomy between tradition, this is Saturn things, tradition and structure and boundaries and rules, commitment, focus, sobriety, seriousness, and then on the other hand, fluidity, emotional sensitivity, the sense of needing to nurture and be nurtured, the need for the creation of meaning and closeness and intimacy, family, and the ties or bonds of family. So in many ways, you also are pitting summer and winter against one another. Saturn, the first sign of winter, Saturn ruling Capricorn, the first sign of winter, and the moon ruling Cancer, which is the first sign of summer. So those qualities are always they always come up. There's a summery / wintry kind of tension in the air when these two planets get together. Everything's feeling nice, and then something hard, cold, stark, severe, intense will pop into the picture. And that's a little bit of Pluto in the wintry sign of Capricorn. So we're dealing with that again once a month for a really long time now. There is often a theme of purgation with Pluto, of things being released that are pent up or held back or kept in, and the eruption of forces from the unconscious, or the sort of idea of things that are subterranean or underworld, situated in the underworld, and then they come up into our awareness. They come up into, the daylight. Now, in most horror movies, the zombies, the vampires, whatever they are, they can't really come out in daytime, But that's not really the case with moon opposite Pluto, because you got the moon in Cancer is really pretty summery and sunshiny and nice. I read a quote the other day. Someone sent me a quote from Billy Corgan, who's the lead singer of the Smashing Pumpkins. It was like a childhood rock icon of mine, probably of some of you too. And he said something like, what do you like least about Cancers, or what do you like most about Cancers, or something like that. What drives you crazy about each sign, and he was asking about Cancers, and he said, they think that they're warming the whole world with their sunshine. And I thought that was so funny, because it's totally a hidden kind of vanity about, Cancers potentially to sort of think of themselves as like the universal mother or whatever. So you're just, we're just us Cancers. I'm a Cancer sun. We're all just so sweet, So at any rate, I got a laugh out of that. And then I kind of felt relieved knowing he was a Pisces, and that I was like, well, he's prone to complaining and whining about sunshiny things. So I'm just kidding. So at any rate, we had a laugh about that with a friend of mine, and but that's the thing, is that Cancer is sunshiny. There's a kind of just a mood of romantic, nostalgic summer days, and you get that feeling that the moon, which rules Cancer, is associated with the creation of meaning, and it's also associated with memory and reflectiveness, and so there's a mood of keeping what's sacred and what's treasured. I was on the beach in North Carolina last week, and in the morning I was doing my like my morning practice, and I was watching these crabs like come out of their little holes, and they were taking little things that they found on the beach and like bringing them into their holes, and I was like, it's like, hey, I do that too. There's a desire to hold and possess, and it's maybe more emotional and a little bit more ethereal with Cancers sometimes. Not like a Taurus, where it's like, I'm holding my mug of damn fine coffee or whatever. Twin Peaks reference if you don't know. And but Cancers, they hold things in a little bit more of a subtle manner. And so but that sunshiny kind of nostalgia and holding things forever. And then comes Pluto, just tearing into the scene, and, just erupts with the cold, hard, like that. It's disturbing, it disturbs the peace, but sometimes the peace needs to be disturbed because there's some kind of false sunshine going on, And so those are some of the things that you often see when the moon opposes Pluto. For a long time now, you see the cheery, nesty thing being disrupted. For example, I just got up this morning knowing Pluto's coming in. Moon's opposing Pluto. Moon was also opposing Saturn yesterday, and I said, how did you sleep last night to my wife. I'm helping, kind of training. We do co-sleeping with our kids, and I've been training my daughter to sleep on her own. So I've been in her room while my wife is with co-sleeping with the baby in the other room. How did you sleep last night? And she said, do you see the sheets all over the floor? And I was like, oh, yeah, what happened? She was like, baby overnursed and just like, projectile vomited or whatever. And our daughter's name is Summer. So it was like, yesterday she was like, just, hell on wheels. You know what I mean? She was just really had a rough day, and then, capped it off with some good projectile vomiting. And so, my wife's a Cancer rising. So this was one of those moments for both of us where we were just like, oh my God, like, you could really feel the opposition to Saturn yesterday, a pending opposition to Pluto, like this sweet little, sunshiny day, and routines that we're used to at the infant are like, being disturbed by like the beast that's awakening. So anyway, it was another example of moon opposite Pluto. So the other things that you can think about with moon opposite Pluto will be for eruptions of unconscious material, for dealing with those things, and then for the keyword of purgation. Everyone loves to talk about purging and releasing things. I joke around a lot that there should be different kinds of like new age quarter jars that you have to put a quarter in every time you say something. And I think you could put right in there, I'm releasing so much right now. I'm letting go of so much. I'm like that. I'm purging so much. And then I need a quarter jar for sure. I drank ayahuasca for 10 years and, really got into some pretty serious purging. So a purging is, not a bad thing. There's a lot of time in life where we need to purge or we need to release, and that's a natural thing. We see this all the time. We see this in nature where there is a gathering of storm clouds and then they burst, or there's a pent up amount of water and it floods over. Things gather and accumulate, and there's a force that gathers and accumulates, and oftentimes it's below the surface because we're neglecting something, or something is building up in an area we're not aware of, and then it releases. And this is natural. So a lot of the times some of the spiritual message that I wanted to share a little bit around this transit today is that one of the reasons I say we need a quarter jar for the idea of releasing is that sometimes we treat releasing as though it's the goal of spiritual life, to release, to let go of things that are no longer serving us, et cetera, et cetera. And one of the reasons I'm very passionate about trying to address this particular topic is that it's not a unique thing to release. It's actually a natural thing to release. It happens over and over and over again. It becomes problematic when we start thinking about releasing as tantamount to spiritual growth. It can be releasing things, purging things, letting go of things, having things come up, and then we see them and we become aware of them, and like that. It can be a vital part of spiritual growth in our lives. But it's also a natural thing. It's natural to the human psyche. It's natural to the natural environment because it's all part of the same natural material substance. All these different material forces are flowing along, and they do this. The Tao tells us this, that things collect and gather and then release and disseminate. So we shouldn't treat it, in other words, like it's some incredibly rare occurrence. This happens even in terms of more massive stages or periods in time where there are, dark ages and golden ages for almost all ancient thinkers. They viewed time cyclically, and there's a circulation of ages. So even ages that appear to be filled with like purgation and releasing of just like pent up dark energies or whatever, even those are seen in terms of a larger cycle of yin and yang and building up and letting go. So these things are natural. And one of the, so it can be very, so it's good to purge. There's nothing wrong with it. But again, for some people, we believe that purging is tantamount to spiritual growth, like eliminating something is the same, is equivalent to growing. And that's not necessarily the case. Take, for example, a garden. A lot of the times, all gardeners know that you have to weed your garden. Now, my wife is a defender and advocate of weeds because a lot of what people end up considering weeds are actually very medicinal. But let's just throw that out for a second and say that, your sort of garden variety weeds and weeding that you have to do. Weeding itself does not make the garden grow. Weeding is a part of taking care of a garden, but the garden needs its own care, and the plants and fruits to come into their own need their care of their own. They need to grow in their own way. So taking bad things out or seeing the weed come up and being like, there's a weed, let's get rid of it. That's not always the same thing as spiritual growth. Yet sometimes people think that it is. And so sometimes there's kind of a culture that adores and glorifies bringing up dramatic, heavy, intense stuff. We get addicted to the catharsis of seeing, the junk that comes up from the pipes, so to speak. And we're like, oh, look at that. It's really nasty. I'm glad that came up. I'm glad that's out of there. I'm going to be healthier now. Well, in one sense, it's true, right? I mean, take, for example, the body. My daughter, you drink too much or you take too much on, you got to get rid of it because otherwise it's going to upset the system. So there is something about elimination that is healthy. Anyone who's ever done a cleanse or any kind of clearing diet or fast from TV or anything, eliminating is a form of, when you eliminate something, oftentimes the natural healthiness is restored. So of course, we understand that. But again, sometimes people believe that it's the purgation that somehow atones for something. Like I've purged it, I've released it, and this kind of pain that I went through, sometimes it becomes a little sadomasochistic, a little enjoying of the pain of removing burdensome energies or something like that. And then we think that because we've removed something that we've atoned for problems in our lives, and therefore we're sort of leveling up and we can get a little bit of an ego about it. The Bhagavad Purana has this wonderful verse in the 6th canto that talks about an elephant and an elephant that goes in and bathes, and it washes itself off from everything. So it's like eliminating all the dirt. But then once the elephant gets out of the water, it immediately falls down and rolls in the dirt again, right? It's like, so this example is used to talk about why it's not enough to simply karmically purge or cleanse ourselves over and over and over again in a material sense. For example, many people are addicted to cleanses. Many people will cleanse like 3 or 4 times a year, and then they go right back and hit the opposite extreme of like eating like crap. Or lots of people will, they take up spiritual life like it's a boot camp program at the gym. Like, got to get back on my spiritual path. And so we go in the same pattern where we're like cleansing, eliminating, purging all the dirt that we've accumulated in the material sense, like too many sweets or too many, whatever the bad habits are that we've gotten into that we feel like have gotten us uncentered or clouded the mind or complicated our relationships or jammed up our free space or whatever. We get rid of all of it. And we go to spiritual boot camp, and then, we cleanse ourselves all over again. And then what happens? We come out and then we throw dirt on ourselves. We just get right back into it. And then this creates a culture that is obsessed with the extremes of back and forth of indulgence and renunciation. And we imagine that the amazing torturousness of this back and forth is spiritual life. It's a spiritual life in the trenches. This is what it's all about. I'm working. Well, maybe we should consider the idea that spiritual life does not need to be so laborious like that. It doesn't need to be so torturous. It doesn't need to polarize us back and forth between these extremes all the time. Again, not to say that there isn't a space for releasing or purging or whatever, but spiritual releasing, what does that look like? Well, okay, there's times where there's going to be elimination, but one of the most important questions we have to ask ourselves is, not just, am I eliminating the weeds? Am I addressing and looking at the unconscious stuff? Am I going into my shadows? All of these are quarter jars to a certain extent, right? But also, what am I adding? One of my teachers likes to say, content is what determines contentment. It's a very simple idea. But if we're not, as we're eliminating, facing, looking at things, purging, processing, all of these words that we use, and if we don't take time to add something in, higher content in our life that helps us develop a higher taste, a healthier taste of some kind for spiritual life, for devotional living. If we don't have that, then the polarization just keeps going back and forth, and we call that spiritual, but it's really just a roller coaster ride. So some of the simplest things we can ask ourselves right now, as we're seeing whatever's going to come up, or we're seeing that shadow material come up, just ask ourselves, okay, great that this is coming up. Is there space now? Is there more room for me to now add something that's healthier? For example, one of the simplest ways to help a person progress in their diet is not just to eliminate bad things, but to add good things, like add some greens, add vegetables to your diet, add things that will start helping you cultivate a different kind of taste, because elimination alone isn't enough. I remember similarly when I was a kid that at, church, every week someone would, same people would come up to altar calls and so forth at our more charismatic, there's different worship services we had. One of the worship services was more charismatic, and people would sometimes commit their lives to the church and to Christ and things like that. And when they would do that, it was sometimes real emotional, because it's time to surrender, this kind of thing. But you see people doing it every single week. And so similarly in the Catholic Church, I know many people I've spoken with in my practice that grew up going to confession, being made to go to confession over and over and over again. And they say, well, I just end up admitting the same things every week over and over and over and over again. And then I'd be purged and cleansed, and then mess up and then be purged and cleansed, and like that. So be careful of that, the emotional, the addiction to the emotional catharsis of purging and exploring the unconscious and whatever. I can't think of one. Most spiritual programs out there, the tagline is like, evolve your consciousness, awaken your consciousness, eliminate doubts, transform limitations, right? But these are very heroic things. It doesn't really break down to what everyday life is like. Everyday life is actually rather mundane. What you're really looking for is, how can you fill 2 to 3 hours with content while you're doing the menial tasks of life that can keep you kind of vibrating at a nice level? Like, that's actually the most basic question. It's not like, go to the WWF slam match of spiritual awakening. It's like everyday life just isn't that dramatic. Of course, there are big dramatic events, and sometimes we're going through a major crisis or something like that, and we do need that kind of support. We're ready for, getting in the arena and being with people who are trying to transform in some crazy way. But there's, again, this Moon opposite Pluto is also just notorious for, trying to hook people in emotionally with the idea that, like, do this or sign up for that, and like, you'll release all of your demons, and like you'll blow out the top with amazing spiritual insight, and da, da, da. And then no, it actually breaks down to like, if you've got 2 kids, and they're screaming and you have to make dinner, how do you get through that 20 minutes while trying to keep your vibe a little bit intact. You know what I mean? So usually those kinds of questions are the things that everybody is dealing with. And in order to address those things, we usually have to add simple things to our life, not eliminate big toxic demons. And I'm saying this as someone who, I drank ayahuasca for 10 years, where you do a lot of the, you're purging a lot of big stuff. You know what I mean? But what I saw after drinking ayahuasca for 10 years was that the people who were there over and over and over again, including myself on some level, also struggled to just figure out how to be in everyday life, in the mundane details of life, and find beauty in them, and find rhythm in them, and find the same depth of meaning and the same level of awe and mystery as there is in these, peak states of facing the demons and challenging the shadows. And it's like life isn't so heroic like that all of the time. And so when I felt the call to step away from the ayahuasca world, not because of anything that's wrong with it, one of the main reasons I did so is because I realized, hey, this is a message I need. I need to just figure out what it looks like to fill my life with content that I know is good and healthy spiritually, and just try to walk that path without, getting into the slam match of spiritual growth, So at any rate, those are just some thoughts to think about. Now, I say that also, I share that story because what was it that helped me take a step away from the ayahuasca world, which was a good, timely thing for me? It was a Pluto moon transit. It's a Pluto moon transit. All right, so Saturn is stationing. Saturn is stationing to turn direct. I had a very interesting conversation with someone recently. We were talking about Saturn in their birth chart, and they said, is there anything I can do in my birth chart to sort of remediate Saturn? And this is a really good question that I actually get more times than I can count, not just with Saturn, but other things that people have troubles with in their birth chart, like a difficult planet over here in your money house, or whatever. People always want to know, well, what can I do? What else can I call on in my chart? And my answer is usually a little, it's a little mixed. First of all, this idea of like going into the chart and looking for planets or energies that could alleviate Saturn is rather new. It's not that remediation is new. Of course, there's been herbs and talismans and different, kinds of ceremonial magic that have been used for thousands of years to try to remediate the effects of a bad, the difficult effects of a bad planet or whatever. But there's another side of the story, and that's that there is sometimes, again, a kind of a new age move is to try to eliminate things that we feel are blocking us or limiting us or getting in the way of having something that we want. And of course, it's not bad to have desires. It's not, we're human, it's like it's pretty natural to have desires, and we're not, none of us are bodhisattvas yet, as far as I can tell. But there's another answer to dealing with Saturn, especially when Saturn's stationing and there's a weight that's kind of starting to bear down. There's a shift of momentum happening in your life in some area. Usually right now you would want to check the Capricorn ruled house of your chart, around 2 to 3 degrees of Capricorn, or just the whole sign house of Capricorn. But where there's just some shift that's taking place, there's a weightiness and usually with Saturn, in moments like this, I get clients who are dealing with Saturn. It's like Saturn stuff starts pouring in, and this is like, I decided, this would be a good thing to talk about. So this woman said, how can I remediate, the effects of Saturn? Like, what else can I call on in my chart? And one of the things that I try to remind people of is that Saturn is almost always best dealt with when you don't try to change Saturn. Saturn will remain this kind of heavy. I mean, in alchemy, Saturn is related to lead. It's very heavy. It's not, you don't change that very easily. Like you don't just like walk up to a piece of lead and be like, how can I like manipulate you so that you look more sparkly or whatever. Like you can paint lead in sparkly paint, but it'll still be like lead. So we can't avoid Saturn is the main thing. And I'm really sort of cautious about the reactive like jump to try to remediate difficult things. So Saturn, for example, Saturn often hides behind certain things in our lives, certain topics. Where are you very convicted, very hardworking, very serious, very committed, and you take yourself seriously. You feel respectable, or you respect something. And where is this sense of gravity and a weighty sense of consequence in your life? Like, where do you place those things? Where does the gravity pull you down into something that's heavier? The results matter. You're concerned about the outcomes. That is where Saturn often hides in our lives. And we remember Saturn's sign of Saturn's exaltation is Libra. Libra is the sign of the scales, the balance. It's a airy, light Venetian place. It's the gateway of the autumn equinox. It's very poised and thoughtful and harmonious, right? Saturn loves that place because there is a sense of Saturn's gravity, right? And Saturn's heaviness and Saturn's weight on the soul, so to speak, being noble, being virtuous, being elevated, being okay, being lofty. And so that's why, in a sense, Saturn is exalted in this sort of airy, light place. For example, if you've ever been to Washington, D.C., where I live, and you go from one monument to the next in the tour of D.C., which I kind of had to do when I got here. I had gone on one when I was in like 7th grade with my social studies class, got to take a trip to DC or something, and then my parents let me go, and it's totally different as an adult though. And so one of the things you'll notice in the museums around here is this very airy, sort of pristine cleanliness and loftiness. Everything's high up. There's these clean white pillars and things etched into stone. It's all like a lot of like very idealistic philosophy and constitutional rhetoric and stuff like that, right? Justice, truth, equality, democracy. It's like, oh, just like it's like that. That's Saturn in Libra, right? That's that kind of like, but it's stone. It's heavy. It's like foundational, and yet it hides behind the sense of like an angelic choir that's singing somewhere up in the Roman like rafters. You know what I mean? So there's in our lives, just take that as an exercise in the archetypal imagination. We like to hide Saturn behind things that are high and lofty, things that we believe are very important, very serious, very like that. And often, so a lot of the times, that's also where our fears live. And that's often where our depressions live. And that's what, yes, someone's mentioning McCain's eulogies. Yeah, it's a very, very good example. Of course, Venus in Libra right now, and he passed right as Venus in Libra was square to Pluto in Capricorn, Saturn's sign. Venus and Saturn's exaltation in Libra, in a whole sign square to Saturn. Same thing. We hide our depression behind things that we think of as grand and noble and true and whatever. We hide our dogmatic rigidness sometimes behind those things. We hide, like, for example, I have exalted Saturn as the ruler of my career house. So I know this very well because, you can't see it right now, but, even my bookshelves have there's like brick. I have like bricks, boards and bricks and stuff like that. And so there's this, but I know very well from my own career life that it's easy. It's an easy place to stash a feeling of heaviness, a feeling of obligation, a feeling of depression, of something being of deep, deep consequence, and that weighs on us. Like that's like mentally taxing. So all of us have Saturn like that in our lives somewhere. Often it hides if it's not overt. Like sometimes our depression, the weightiness, it's just there, and it's in some places very obvious for us. Like, oh, it's in my marriage, or it's with my boss, or it's with my family, or it's with money, or whatever. It's with the sickness I'm dealing with, and that's the weightiness, and it's just there, and it's obvious, and it's right. But other times, the point here is that Saturn hides behind things that we don't realize where the actual burden in our life is, because it cloaks itself in things that are noble and grave and serious and stuff like that. So we can't avoid Saturn. It's like Saturn. If we try to avoid Saturn, Saturn will hide, because in something that we just consider to be no, this is really serious over here. This is serious. This is noble. This is good. This is really true over here. This is really matters. Everyone has something like that in their lives, and so when people say, "How can I remediate Saturn?" I'm like, "That's Saturn speaking," because what are they thinking? This matters. I need to do something. This is heavy. This can't be. I need to take care of this. I don't want to deal with this thing. That's a limit. I don't like that limit. I want to do something. What can I do? How can I remediate it? But that sense of the consequence and like, how can I, right? Anything that you do from that space of control, of seriousness, of dread, of not liking something, of dealing with a limit, and I don't want a limit, and anything you try to address from within the space of that concern is seeding the future karma with the exact same energy. That's the thing that people don't realize about Saturn, and that's why I'm so hesitant to say, just like, float over to your Venus and like everything will get better. It's not like that, because what really matters with Saturn is that we grow into and explore and have a relationship with that area where we kind of get beady-eyed. We get a little beady-eyed, we get a little like there's a little bit of like a golem in each of us, and unless we really go into that and get to know it and get to know where we feel everything is grave and serious and heavy and wintry and consequences matter, and unless we move into that and discover its romantic depths, get to know it on its own terms, which I know sounds very abstract, we will keep trying to remediate it with it. And that doesn't work. It just sends us in a cycle of consequence upon consequence upon consequence that is all rooted in a very serious problem with consequences. This is why so much of the New Age is rooted in the opposite archetype of the puer. The Senex has this heavy, Saturn, but the puer is very Jupiter-like in a sense. The puer is like, well, fly above it. How can I remediate it? What can I do? How can I like soar beyond these problems, whatever. And there's times for that. Like there are some times we're just too serious and too heavy and too grave and everything is too much consequence. And so we need some Peter Pan wings and we just need to soar above that stuff. But again, if we're trying to live, have some healthy relationship to Saturn in our lives, that won't work. It's not. There's certain times when some Jupiter, some puer, we need some spirited optimism, and we need to just let go of all of the heaviness and transcend and all of that. But Saturn doesn't go away that easily. You know what I mean? It's the puer often ends up in mythology. The puer, the young, eternal youth kind of figure, ends up with a limp or broken or harmed foot. There's a sense of the feet being damaged or the wings that are damaged and clipped. And that's Saturn. That's Saturn is the limp old man, who once was the puer, like embittered, some of the greatest problems that we have in our culture in the United States have to do with aging. There's a culture of total delusional defiance against the natural process of aging. This is, in a sense, an unhealthy relationship with Saturn. I don't want to age. I don't want to age. What can I do to never, and that's the same thing with Gollum. If you think about the Lord of the Rings, and he wore the ring of power, and he didn't want to ever let go of the power. Saturn, ruler of the Golden Age, didn't want to let go of power, was usurped by Zeus Jupiter, falls down and becomes this kind of curmudgeonly figure. We don't like aging. Nobody likes to age, but these are good. Having a relationship with time and aging and like that is very healthy. And when Saturn turns direct, there's as it is doing right now, there is a unique moment available for us where we can find what James Hillman once called the limit of limits, which means you get to a place where you come to when you really accept Saturn, when you really get down to it, it's rather than having Saturn, kind of pushing you to try and overcome all these obstacles, and there's this heavy feeling of, like I got to do something. I don't want this to happen. What's going to happen? That kind of existential dread and anxiety. When you go into it and you allow for it to be, and you sort of give up, you come to a space where you reach the limits of Saturn. Well, Saturn is often talked about as restriction and limits, and and that's why we don't like it. But when we go into it, all of a sudden we reach the end of it. When we allow ourselves to go into it, we find out that limits themselves have limits. This is a teaching of the I Ching as well. The hexagram limitations, which I believe is 60, says that limitations have limits. And when you reach that place, in alchemy, it was called the nigredo, or the blackening of the black. And it's a stage that we reach in spiritual life where essentially we say, I've reached the limit of this limit. And now I'm familiar with it. I know it. There's a kind of intimacy with it. And it can't sneak up on me and inform everything that I do. For example, some people will not like the fact that they're limited financially, and so they'll spend tons of money trying to get past their limits financially, only to find that when they have what they want, that some limit comes creeping back in. Jim Carrey is a very famous example of a celebrity who has very famously said, you can get it all. You can get everything you want, remove all the obstacles, manifest everything that you want. He's a classic example of someone who actually was doing all these manifestation things, and he got a bunch of stuff. And he said, and at the end of the day, you'll realize that the most liberating place is to come to a place where you don't need or want anything. You don't reject anything, but you don't need or want anything. And that's kind of the limit of the limits. And it's called the nigredo in alchemy because it's a place where there's something deep inside of you. The blackness turns from something that you're opposed to into something that offers a kind of substrata, depth, and richness to your soul. You become mature. Saturn has the ability to become this kind of fertile, deep soil within your heart. And it wisens you, but it has to do with not always like leaping through all of the new age hoops of like, how can I remediate and fix this and like get what I want? So anyway, that's something to think about. Sun is opposing Neptune. The sun traditionally was related to the intelligence. The intelligence has to do with the basic idea of the intelligence is the faculty of the mind. There are different faculties of the mind. The moon is related to the mind as well. Mercury is related to the mind. The sun is also related to the mind. The sun is related to intelligence. And the job of the intelligence is to discriminate or discern between truth and falsity, truth and falseness. Now, that obviously brings up some challenges when you have the sun opposing Neptune in the next, the next 5-6 days. So Saturn stationing, by the way, just backing up a second before I go into this, Saturn stationing, you can think about that in turning direct as something powering up earlier this week, last week, into next week. So it's kind of a wide orb for that one. And going back, as someone asked this question, moon opposite Pluto that I started talking about is just today. Sun opposing Neptune, back to this idea, discerning truth from falseness. How do we see the difference between truth and falseness? Well, first of all, it's not easy in general. Like, it's a process of most of our lives to select from the overwhelming amount of data coming at us what is true and what is false. And that's not just some blank functional activity like, is this data factually true? We're talking about spiritual truth. We're saying, is this thing that's coming toward me or that's coming out of me or whatever, do I judge it to be true? And that's a kind of moral judgment, as well as a kind of energetic feeling about truth and falseness that the sun is constantly performing, you could say. The sun helps us to select what is true from what isn't, but the sun also helps us select a focus and to exclude things that we're not focusing on. So right now, for example, I'm not really focused on the back of my chair. I'm focused on the camera and I'm focused on this. That's the sun, in a sense. That's sort of one of the faculties of the sun. It's about how we point our attention and what we exclude from our attention. It's also about what we discern as true and what we discern as false. This is why the sun is also related to the way in which each of us will try to define ourselves as unique individuals. I am select, I'm different, I'm unique, because we are selecting from a wide variety of images available to us what destiny we would like to pursue, an image of destiny in a sense. And we're selecting that. And in order to be selecting that, we have to push other things aside. The more that we select something over and over and over again, the more we refine our sense of focus in life, which then further defines us as individuals. This is why the sun is also connected with the ego, or the sense of I. The sense of I emerges through a process of selection, selecting things and excluding other things, which is something built from our karma, but it's also built with our free will in this lifetime as well. So all of that is like, okay, that's what the sun is doing. When it opposes Neptune, it's moving into a space where it's confronting in an opposition the god of illusion, deception, intoxication, but also imagination, fantasy, visions, altered states of consciousness. You got poison, and you've got, ambrosia, the nectar of the gods, and you've got, a garden variety, intoxicant. So these kinds of energies in general make it very difficult for the sun to discern what's true and what's false. It's just difficult. Sometimes that's a really good thing, because sometimes we need the intelligence, the process of intelligence has honed in on a focus in life so much. Like, I'm only focused on this one thing, or I'm only selecting certain things that I believe to be true, even though they're not really true. So we narrow our focus all the time. When Neptune comes through, there's an opportunity to have our sense of rightness, our sense of focus, our sense of it being right and true, flooded by data that is overwhelming to that sense of focus, that sense of attentiveness to one kind of truth, or a narrowing of truth. And so the mind can be opened to a huge amount of possibilities. And that's an amazing thing that a sun opposite Neptune transit can do. You can literally be sort of, awakened or a little bit enlightened by having your sense of truth flooded with new possibilities. And with new visions and new images. And also, you can go through a process of disillusionment. Neptune can wash away the illusions that you've been living with, that you've been calling true. Neptune opposite the sun can flood your life and say, you've been focused in a very particular way, but look at how vast this place is. It's infinite. It's that kind of a feeling. So that can be very positive because we get stuck in our sense of truth, even when it's false. So just because we have the faculty to discern between true and false doesn't necessarily mean we're using it correctly. A lot of this has to do with the condition or placement of the sun in the natal chart. But then simultaneously, we also have the possibility of our sense of truth or judgment being distorted, our attention or focus being thrown off, being like the song of the sirens in the Odyssey. Odysseus wants to hear it so bad because everyone says it's so beautiful. So he says, everyone else just cover your ears. But no, Odysseus says, I want to hear it, so that, they tie him to the mast so he can hear it but can't get away or whatever. There's another myth that someone was telling me about the other day that suggested that if the sirens were heard, but you didn't go to them, their song couldn't compel you to go to them where they would devour you, that they would pass away. And this is also a good sort of analogy for, or an appropriate mythology for Sun opposite Neptune. What you're able to withstand right now as the alluring sirens call has the ability to liberate you. You can eliminate, get rid of illusions, and be able to identify false temptations. That these are temptations that aren't going to lead you in a good place. You can identify them and, in a sense, eliminate those temptations in the future by recognizing the temptation and withstanding it right now. The other thing that can happen is, of course, your sense of control can be interrupted in a positive way or a negative way. Your sense of truth can be distorted. You can be deceived. So these are different things that can happen with Sun opposite Neptune, which is going to culminate on September 9th with a new moon opposite Neptune. So the entire lunar cycle ahead is in some ways encapsulating these themes. So that's just some stuff to think about there with the Sun opposite Neptune. Mercury is about to enter Virgo, and that's going to happen in the next day or so. And it'll gain a whole bunch of dignity. It goes into its own sign and its own exaltation. You got a very capable, detail-oriented, task and production-oriented Mercury coming up. It's going to hit a trine to Saturn right away. It's a very fruitful, productive moment, especially as Saturn's turning around. You're going to be thinking about doing, taking care of all the earthy energy, practical things that matter or have some element of seriousness to them. That's the Saturn trine. So that's kind of beneficial. But remember that, I'm gonna take care of this once and for all. So this is never a limitation again. But that weightiness behind the intention, that's Saturn still. So remember, even though this is a time of effectiveness with Mercury entering Virgo, moving into a trine with Saturn in the next 5-6 days here, that whatever you're doing right now, trying to get something done, just remember the image of trying to dig out a hole of sand, and the wind's blowing into the sand just keeps seeping back in. In a sense, anything that we try to solve in this material world, using stuff of this world repeatedly over and over again because it's all driving us mad and we're trying to control and perfect it, it's a cycle and it's maddening. So remember that as you might be very productive in the next week, but just try to figure out how can I be productive while realizing that ultimately my happiness is not dependent upon this productivity, because productivity comes with results have to be maintained, results cannot live forever, they eventually dissipate. So just remember that as you're working, as really why the phrase whistle while you work is such a good one for lots of Earth and Saturn energy. Just a reminder that it's it's really about, as they say, it's about the journey. Finally, Venus is square Mars. I talked about that yesterday. So sort of sexual creative tension in the air, the relationship tension between Venus and Mars. I'm going to be talking about Venus and Mars a little later in the week, so I'll just refer you to my horoscope from yesterday for that one. And I'll be doing a little bit more focused attention to Venus square Mars soon. So if you need more on that, though, look at my wall on my Facebook page or my website, www.nightlightastrology.com, and you can see what I wrote about that one yesterday. Also, I want to turn your attention before we leave for the day or before I take questions to a few things. Actually, I'll take questions first. Let's go back up through this and see what we've got. Tropical storm here in Florida since last night. Oh gosh, yeah. Yeah, that sounds a little bit like Moon Pluto. Needed to hear this about purging today. Major stuff coming up. Thank you once again. You bet. The Virgo season plus Moon Pluto opposition truly speaks to my compulsive desire to colon cleanse when my anxiety is high. Yeah, that's brilliant. That's exactly it. Shoshana says, grand trine in water today, Moon, Neptune, Jupiter. Ah, yes. Nice. Let's see. And speaking of Saturn, it seems as though as a culture we demonize or avoid even acknowledging Saturnian reality. Yes, which in itself is Saturnine. That's what I've always tried to bring that out, is that when you demonize Saturn, you're playing right into the realm of Saturn, because the demonization thing, to take something so gravely that you have to condemn it, be concerned about it, not like it, want to make it lighter, all of that, that's Saturn. We can never forget that Saturn is the ruler of the golden age who falls out of that position. So our inability to live with the reality of darkness because we prefer a golden age is part of Saturn's complex. Okay. Hello. Someone saying hello from another person from Florida. Florida crew in the house today. Saturn in my first house, duty, responsibility, and seriousness, but I've learned to embrace that part of me. Feel I'm becoming younger as I grow older. That's a funny thing about Saturn. When you get to that space with Saturn, the limits of the limits, there's a lightness that comes in, and a kind of ironic sense of youthfulness. So yeah, Saturn's like that. They often say Saturnian people age like wine. If you do it right, there's a sense of becoming. Youth is harder than old age in some ways. Anyway, does the sun dry up Neptune's delusion? Yeah, like I said, it's a good time to possibly see through or sort of cut through illusion with intelligence. But the illusion that's presented is more overpowering potentially as well with the opposition. It doesn't mean it's all just illusion either. Remember, there's some potentially very positive things that Neptune wants to offer us that the sun maybe is going to level up in terms of its ability to perceive something greater. You could think about it like that. Oh my, I took vacation days this week so that I can write a proposal for restructuring my department. How timely. Yeah, that's Mercury, Saturn coming up. You have nice energy for that. Okay, so thank you for all your questions. I want to point your attention to two things. One is that at the end of this month, I'm participating in something called the Astrology Hub Summit. So I just put this in the box. You can find it there. It's free. I think you can buy recordings. I'm an affiliate because I'm talking at the program. And so some portion of the proceeds, if you end up buying audio, goes back to me, at which point I'll be giving them to charity. So anything that comes back from the link that you use by signing up, that comes back to me as an affiliate, I'll be giving to, I have a couple of different charities that I give to. I'm not sure which one I'm going to do yet, but I'll be giving whatever I get back to charity. So this is in the chat box there, so you can check it out. It's free though. I mean, you can sign up. There's a lot of good speakers. I'm not a fan of every single speaker on the list, like their thinking or their way of doing things, but probably some of them aren't a fan of mine. So, but it's a good list. I think it's a good lineup with a lot of different interesting subjects. So check it out. See, last but not least, you can check out my website, nightlightastrology.com. Readings, classes. My next class is coming up in November. So it's on Saturdays. It's a year-long natal astrology course on Saturdays. So there's need-based tuition options and stuff like that. I'll be advertising more of that soon. Okay, everyone, we're an hour in, and that's it for today. So I hope you all have a beautiful day, and we'll see you sometime in the next few days. Another one I'll be doing on the Venus-Saturn square. Okay, take care, everybody.